What were you taught about the end of the American Revolution? The British surrendered at Yorktown, everyone shook hands, wrote the Constitution, and lived happily ever after, right? Well, that is a lie. The years between the end of the war and the start of the presidency were the most dangerous years in American history. We didn't have a president. We didn't have a Supreme Court. We didn't even have a real currency. The United States wasn't a country yet. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The 13 colonies were acting like 13 separate, squabbling countries. They were taxing each other's goods, fighting over borders, and printing their own money that was often worth less than the paper it was printed on. Meanwhile, the British were just across the border in Canada, watching and waiting, expecting the whole American experiment to collapse so they could come back and pick up the pieces, and they almost got their wish. Because in 1786, the very veterans of the Revolution, the men who had bled for freedom, picked up their muskets again. But this time they weren't aiming at redcoats, they were aiming at their own government. Welcome to Part 4. This is the collapse. To understand the panic that gripped the nation, you have to understand the government we started with. It wasn't the Constitution. It was a document called the Articles of Confederation, and it was designed to be incredibly weak on purpose. Fresh from a war against a king, Americans were terrified of a strong central government, so they created one that couldn't do much of anything. It couldn't collect taxes, it couldn't raise a national army, it couldn't enforce its own laws. It was officially called a League of Friendship, which is a very polite way of saying it was a debating club with absolutely no power. As you can imagine, with a government this helpless, the economy completely crashed, and the people who got hit the hardest were the soldiers. These were men who had spent 6 long years fighting alongside George Washington. They returned home to their farms, not with back pay, but with worthless government IOUs, to make matters worse. They found local courts seizing their land and livestock because they couldn't pay the very taxes that had skyrocketed to pay off war debts. They had fought for liberty, and their reward was the threat of debtor's prison. In western Massachusetts, a farmer and decorated war hero named Captain Daniel Shays decided he had seen enough. Shays wasn't some radical traitor. He was a patriot. He had fought bravely at Bunker Hill and Saratoga. The Marquis de Lafayette himself had honored him with a ceremonial sword for his service. But when the courts threatened to take his farm, he did what Americans do when they feel their rights are being violated. He organized. Shays rallied an army of nearly 4,000 angry farmers and veterans. They weren't just protesting. They were taking action. They marched on the county courthouses and shut them down at gunpoint, preventing any more foreclosures. They burned debt records, effectively wiping the slate clean. They even threatened to march on the city of Boston and burn it to the ground. The situation was spiraling out of control. The governor of Massachusetts was in a full-blown panic. He begged the national government, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, for help. He needed troops to put down the rebellion, but the national government was so broke and so weak it couldn't send a single soldier. It couldn't do anything. America's elite, the wealthy merchants, the landowners. The founders realized with horror that the inmates were running the asylum. The government they had created was powerless to protect itself. George Washington, watching all this unfold from his retirement at Mount Vernon, was deeply disturbed. He wrote letters to his friends asking, "Are we to have the goodly fabric that 8 years were spent in raising, pulled over our heads?" He feared the dream of America was turning into a nightmare before it had even truly begun. Shays Rebellion was eventually crushed, but not by the American government. It was put down by a private mercenary army, funded out of the pockets of Boston's richest merchants who feared losing their own fortunes. The rebellion was over, but the message was crystal clear to everyone. The Articles of Confederation were a death sentence. The League of Friendship was a failure. If they didn't fix this broken system and fix it fast, the entire revolution would have been for nothing. This crisis was the catalyst for what came next. In May of 1787, 55 men from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. They told the public they were just there to make a few small tweaks to the Articles of Confederation. That was a lie. They were there to overthrow the government. They locked the doors of the State House. They nailed the windows shut to keep the press and the public out. This wasn't a public hearing. It was a secret coup. For 4 long, hot summer months, they argued. The debates were fierce. The small states, like Delaware, demanded equal power, fearing they'd be swallowed by the large states. The big states, like Virginia, insisted on representation based on population. The northern states wanted a federal government that could regulate trade and build a manufacturing economy. The southern states, however, were terrified of a government that might interfere with their most valuable economic asset, slavery. And this is where we have to confront the ugly truth of America's founding. The Constitution, the document we revere today, was a deal with the devil. To get the southern states to agree to a strong central government, the northern delegates made a terrible compromise. They agreed to protect the international slave trade for another 20 years. They also agreed to the infamous 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress. This gave the South disproportionate power that would last for decades. They saved the nation in 1787 by planting the seeds of the Civil War in 1861. They kicked the can down the road, but in September, after months of secrets and compromises, they emerged from that locked room with a document that began with 3 revolutionary words: "We the people." It was a radical departure from the old way of thinking. Power no longer came from a king or a parliament, but from the citizens themselves. The new Constitution wasn't perfect. It was a messy, compromised, and deeply controversial document, but it created a government that could actually govern. It could tax, it could raise an army. It could regulate commerce, and it could enforce its laws. It created a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. It created the framework for the United States we know today. Now, all they needed was a leader. They needed a man to be the very first president, to take this brand new blueprint and turn it into a functioning reality. The choice was obvious. There was only one person on earth that all 13 states, from north to south, trusted to wield this new power responsibly. A man who, ironically, didn't even want the job. Join us for Part 5 next time, as George Washington is called out of retirement to invent the presidency from scratch and tries to survive the Shark Tank of early American politics. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.